Hello everyone, so I'm back again and now we're going to start over the section which helps us to choose the parameters or the hyperparameters for our neural network. So we're covering this wonderful book by Michael Nielsen on neural networks and deep learning, and we have almost finished chapter 3. This is probably the last video. So let's just try to get it over with. Up until now, I haven't explained how I've been choosing values for hyperparameters such as the learning rate, their regularization, and so on. I've been supplying values which work very well. In practice, when you're using neural nets to attack a problem, it can be difficult to find good hyperparameters. Trust me, this is a understatement. It is really difficult at times. Imagine, for example, that we've just been introduced to the MNIST problem and have begun working on it. Knowing nothing at all about what hyperparameters to use, let us suppose that by good fortune in our first experiment we choose many of the hyperparameters in the same way as was done earlier. 30 hidden neurons, a mini batch of 10, training for 30 epochs using cross entropy, learning, but we choose the learning rate eta to be 10 and the regularization parameter to be 1000. And in one such run, you'll see the accuracy is very low. So our classification accuracies are no better than chance. Our network is acting as a random noise generator. And well, that's easy to fix. You might say just decrease the learning rate and regularization hyperparameters. Unfortunately, we don't know a priori know those are the hyperparameters you need to adjust. Maybe the real problem is that our 30 hidden neurons network will never work well, no matter what the other hyperparameters are chosen. Alright, so what they're trying to say is now that you have seen a working model, you can just say that since the learning rate is too high, we'll reduce it. Since the regularization parameter is too high, we'll reduce it. But if you're someone new who hasn't ever seen neural networks, there you might just think that a 30 hidden network layer is the main cause, or what should we do to fix it. You won't really have a clear cut uh, understanding of what's really going wrong. Maybe we need at least 100 hidden neurons or 300 neurons or multiple layers or a different approach to encoding the output. Maybe a network is learning but we need to train for more epochs. Maybe the mini batches are small. Maybe we do better switching back to gradient quadratic cost function. Maybe we need to try a different approach to weight initialization, and so on and on. It's easy to feel lost in the hyperparameter space. This can be particularly frustrating if your network is very large or uses a lot of training data, since you may train for hours or days or weeks only to get no result. If the situation persists, it damages your confidence. Maybe neural networks are the wrong approach to your problem. Maybe you should quit your job and take up beekeeping. In this section, I explain some heuristics which can be used to set the hyperparameters. The goal is to help you develop a workflow. I won't cover everything about hyperparameter optimization because that's a huge subject, of course, and it's not in any case a problem that can be completely solved or there is a general solution. There are always some tricks which you can use, but the heuristics should help us get started. Alright. So the broad strategy is when we use a neural network, uh, the first challenge is to get any non-trivial learning. So that if it was a 10% chance that a model would predict the correct output at random, then we at least perform better than that. So let's look at some strategies for that. So suppose you're attacking the MNIST for the first time and you start out enthusiastic but are a little discouraged when your first network fails. The way is to strip down the problem. Okay, let's get rid of all the training and validation images except images which are zeros and ones. Then try to train a network to distinguish zeros from ones. Not only is that an inherently easier problem than distinguishing all 10 digits, it also reduces the amount of training data by 80%, speeding up the training by a factor of 5. Alright, so when you only consider zeros and ones, you've essentially discarded 2 to 9. So the training data has gone down by 80% since you're only now evaluating on 20%. And since now you're only focused on 20%, the training speed increases by a factor of 5. So you can experiment much faster. You don't need to wait like 10 minutes for your network to train every time you make slight tweaks. Alright. You can further speed up by stripping your network down to a simple network and only have the 784 inputs and 10 outputs rather than having the 30 hidden layer neuron, so that you can train the network faster. So if you believe a network can do better than chance classification of MNIST, then begin your experimentation with such a network. Alright. You can also get speed up in experimenting by increasing the frequency of monitoring. So with 50,000 images per epoch, that means waiting a little while, about 10 seconds per epoch. on my laptop while training a 784-3010 network before getting feedback on how well the network is doing. Alright. Of course, 10 seconds isn't very long, but if you want to trial dozens of hyperparameter choices, it's annoying, right? You will have to wait 10 seconds or even more. So we can get feedback more quickly by monitoring the validation accuracy more often. So after every 1,000 training images, we can have a look at the validation accuracy to see what's really happening. Furthermore, instead of using the full 10,000 image validation set, we can just use 100 validation images. Alright. So all that matters is that the network sees enough images to do real learning and to get pretty good estimate of the performance. So of course, a program network 2.py doesn't currently do this kind of monitoring, but as a class to achieve a similar effect for the purpose of illustration, we strip down our training data to the first 1,000 MNIST training images, and let's try to implement what happens. Alright, so now you only have the first 1,000 images and lambda is 1,000 and so on. So we are still getting pure noise, right? Because you see only 10% are being classified correctly. So, but there is a big win. We are now getting feedback in a fraction of a second rather than once every 10 seconds or so. That means you can more quickly experiment with other choices of hyperparameters, right? So now you can say tweak some of these, see what's happening to the network, and see that very quickly. So in the above example, I left lambda as lambda 1,000 as we used earlier, but since we changed the number of training examples, we should really change lambda to keep the weight decay the same. That means changing lambda to 20. If we do that, then this will happen. Alright. So what he's trying to say is when you had lambda 1,000, it was based on having all the 50,000 images. But now since we only have 1,000 images, we've reduced it by a factor of 50. So lambda will also reduce by a factor of 50, which is now 20. So you can see it first classified 12, then 14, then 25, and so on. So we have a signal, not a terribly good signal, but a signal nonetheless that something is happening inside the network. The network is trying to do something. And now we need to modify the hyperparameters. So maybe we guess that our learning rate needs to be higher. As you perhaps realize, that's a silly guess for reasons we'll discuss shortly, but please bear with me. So to test, we try dialing eta up to 100, and what we see is nothing is happening. So our guess was wrong. So instead, we tried dialing down eta, and we see something happens. The accuracy begins with 62 on 42 on 43 and 61. So that's better. And as we continue testing our hyperparameters and adjusting them, we are gradually improving our performance. So if we go in a direction where the performance is not improving, we won't. We'll try to come back. Alright, the best way to say that. Then experiment with a more complex architecture. So now once we've done with this architecture, we'll try to add hidden layers. Say we add 10 hidden neurons and adjust eta and lambda. Then we increase it to 20 hidden neurons, then again adjust and so on, and keep using our validation data to evaluate. So as we do so, it typically takes longer to witness the impact due to modification of the hyperparameters, of course, because hyperparameters are uh, as you are increasing the complexity of the network, it will take longer to see the results, and so we can gradually decrease the frequency of monitoring. Alright. This all looks very promising as a broad strategy. However, I want to return to the initial stage of finding hyperparameters that enable a network to learn anything. In fact, even the above discussion conveys too positive an outlook. It can be immensely frustrating to work with a network that's learning nothing. You can tweak hyperparameters for days and still get to no meaningful response. And so I'd like to re-emphasize that during the early stages, you should make sure you can get quick feedback from experiments. Intuitively, it may seem as though simplifying the problem and the architecture will merely slow you down. In fact, it speeds things up since you much more quickly find a network with a meaningful signal. Once you've got such a signal, you can often get rapid improvement by tweaking the hyperparameters. As with many things in life, getting started can be the hardest thing to do. So what they're trying to say is this gives a very positive outlook to neural network training, but in reality it isn't. It isn't like following some ground rules will always get you success, but these are a good starting place. All right. So essentially, we're not really focused on getting a very good result. What we're focused on is to get a network to at least learn something. And once it starts learning, we can then tune our model to make the learning more. Okay, so that's the broad strategy. Let's now look at specific recommendation for setting hyperparameters So we'll be focusing on eta, the L2 regularization parameter, lambda, and the mini-batch size. However, many of these apply to other hyperparameters, including those associated to network architecture. Other forms of regularization, some hyperparameters will meet later in the book, such as the momentum coefficient. Alright. So for the learning rate, suppose we have three MNIST networks with three different learning rates, which are all 10 times the previous one. And so we'll set the other hyperparameters as for the experiments in earlier section, running over 30 epochs, lambda 5, minibatch size 10, and the entire set, and we'll train. So what we are seeing is consistently when our eta is 2.5, the training cost is very high, while when the eta is 0.25 or 0.025, it is lower, but the lowest training cost is for eta is 0.25, but eventually 0.025 and 0.25 meet. So for 0.25, 0.25, the cost decreases smoothly. For 0.25, the cost initially decreases, but after 20 epochs, it is near saturation and thereafter makes random oscillations. And finally, with eta 2.5, the cost makes large oscillations. Okay, so these are the three observations. To understand the reason for the oscillations, let's recall the stochastic gradient descent approach. So if eta is small, it helps us to get down in the valley. If it is too small, it will take a long time. If it is too large, we will just overshoot the valley. So with eta 2.5, it is what is likely happening, but there's an asterisk here. So let's read this. This picture is helpful, but it's intended as an intuition building illustration of what may go on, not as a completely exhaustive explanation. Briefly, a more complete explanation is as follows. Gradient descent uses the first order approximation to the cost function as a guide to how to decrease the cost. For larger eta, higher order terms in the cost function become more important and may dominate the behavior, causing gradient descent to break down. This is especially likely as we approach minima and quasi-minima of the cost function, since near such points the gradient becomes small, making it easier for higher order terms to dominate behavior. Alright, so what really they're trying to say is this is just for intuition purposes, this reasoning, but the actual reasoning is this. So you can sort of read this yourself and try to work out the mathematics. But what they're trying to say is when the eta is high, some terms tend to dominate over the others, which causes this issue. Okay, so when eta is 0.25, the initial steps do take us towards a minimum of the cost function, and it's only when we are near the minimum that we start to suffer from the overshooting problem. So when the minimum is, when eta is 0.25, uh, we see are starting to see random oscillations, right? And when we choose eta is 0.025, which is this blue line here, we don't suffer from the problem at all during the first 30 epochs. Of course, choosing eta so small creates another problem, that is the gradient descent is too small. So an even better approach would be to start with eta is 0.25 and train for 20 epochs, and then switch eta to 0.025 and train later for the remaining 10 epochs. So we'll discuss such techniques which are variable learning rate schedulers later. For now, let's stick to figuring out how to find a single good value of eta. So with this picture, we can set eta as follows. First, estimate the threshold value for eta at which the cost immediately begins decreasing instead of oscillating. Then estimate doesn't need to be accurate. You can estimate the order of magnitude. So you can estimate 0.01, then try out 0.11 and so on until you finally find eta where the cost oscillates or increases during the first few epochs. Alternately, so when you find a eta where the cost is increasing from the very start, you know that going above is only going to cause problems. Alternately, the cost oscillates or increases during the first epochs when eta is 0.01. Then you can try eta even lower. So until you find a value for eta where the cost decreases during the first few epochs. So following this procedure, you can give us an order of magnitude estimate for the threshold value eta. You may optionally refine the estimate to pick the largest value, say zero point 0.5 or zero point 0.2. So they do not need to be super accurate, but they do give us an estimate. So what they're trying to say is, suppose you started with 0.01 and the cost began to decrease in the first few epochs. Then you should try even a larger learning rate to see it, with larger learning rates does the cost decrease even more. But if you hit a value where the cost begins decreasing, then you know that beyond going beyond this will no longer enable us to learn anything meaningful. Also, suppose you started with 0.01 and the training cost was increasing during the first few epochs only. Then you know that going selecting larger values would Using that analogy, overshoot the minima, so you'll try smaller values. Alright. Obviously, the actual value of eta that you should use should be no larger than the threshold value. In fact, if the value of eta is to remain usable over many epochs, then you likely want to use a value for eta that is smaller, say a factor of 2 below the threshold. Such a choice will typically allow you to train for many epochs without causing too much of a slowdown in learning. So this is just a explanation of what I just said. In the case of MNIST data, following the strategy leads to the estimate of zero point 0.1, and after refinement we get zero point 0.5. And from the prescription above, this suggests that eta 0.25 as a value for the learning rate. In fact, I found that eta 0.5 worked well enough over 30 epochs that for the most part I didn't worry about lowering value of eta. So this was just the observation of the author. So this all seems quite straightforward. However, using the training cost to pick eta appears to contradict what I said earlier. Namely, we pick hyperparameters by evaluating performance using the validation data. In fact, we'll use validation accuracy to pick the regularization hyperparameter, the mini batch size, and network parameter such as size. So why do things differently for the learning rate? Frankly, this choice is my personal aesthetic preference and is perhaps somewhat idiosyncratic. The reason is that the other hyperparameters are intended to improve the final classification accuracy, and so it makes sense to select them on the basis of the validation accuracy. However, the learning rate is only incidentally meant to impact the final classification accuracy. Its primary purpose is to really control the step of gradient descent, and monitoring the training cost is the best way to detect if it is too high. And with that said, this is a personal aesthetic preference. Early on during learning, the training cost usually only decreases if the validation accuracy improves, and so in practice, it's unlikely to make much difference. So, what the author is saying that you might be wondering why I did not use the validation data to compute the learning rate eta. So the reason for that is because he believes that it's first of all it's a personal choice of his, and secondly, eta directly affects the step size of gradient descent, which affects training as well. So he also says that you could just have used validation accuracy because the validation accuracy only improves when the training cost decreases usually, and so it doesn't make much of a difference. Alright. Use early stops to determine the number of training epochs. So early stopping means that after each epoch we'll find the classification accuracy, and when it stops improving, we stop training. In particular, it doesn't mean that it means that we don't need to worry about explicitly figuring out the number of epochs. As soon as the model stops learning, then or the accuracy remains constant, we stop. Furthermore, early stopping also automatically prevents us from overfitting because we no longer have the uh, oscillations which are indicative of overfitting, I believe. That is, of course, a good thing. Although in early stages of experimentation, it can be helpful to turn off early stopping so you can see any signs of overfitting and use it to inform your approach to regularization. Alright. To implement early stopping, we need to say more precisely what it means for the classification accuracy to stop improving. As we've seen, the accuracy can jump around a bit. If we stop the first time the accuracy decreases, then we'll certainly stop when there are more improvements to be had because it might just go down a bit and then go up. So a better rule is to terminate if the best classification accuracy doesn't improve for some time, right? So suppose we're doing MNIST and we elect that if in the last 5 or 10 epochs the classification accuracy doesn't improve, then stop. So that is early stopping. The no improvement in 10 rule is good for initial exploration of MS, meaning if it does not improve within 10 epochs. However, networks can sometimes plateau near a classification accuracy for quite some time, only to then begin improving. So if you're trying to get a really good performance, the no improvement in 10 may be too aggressive about stopping. So you may use no improvement in 10 for initial experimenting, and then use some more lenient rules, so 20, 50, and so on epochs to see if is improvement and the network overcomes a plateau of some sort. Of course, this introduces a new hyperparameter to optimize. In practice, however, it's usually easy to set this hyperparameter to get pretty good results. Similarly, for problems other than this, the no improvement in 10 rule may be too aggressive or not nearly aggressive enough, depending on the details of the problem. So maybe uh, even during the 10 epochs, the network would have significantly overfitted in some case. But for the MNIST, it's good enough. Alright. So we haven't used early stopping in our MNIST experiment to date. The reason is that we've been doing a lot of comparisons between different approaches to learning. For such comparisons, it's helpful to use the same number of epochs to see maybe they are overfitting towards the end or not. Alright. So the problem modify network 2.py. So it improves the strategy. You can do this yourself. Alright. Can you think of a rule for early stopping other than no improvement in? Ideally, the rule should comprise getting high validation accuracy and not training too long. After the rule to network to run, add the rule and run three experiments and compare. So one thing could be no improvement in N. We could check the validation accuracy and um, I'm not really sure, but I'll try to get back to you on this one. So let me just pause for a bit. Right. So one approach, as Dave suggested here, could be looking at the average classification accuracy over the last 10 epochs, and we will stop if this is no better than the previous last n. So this might prevent us from stopping early on, and they've also showed their results. So this one performed a bit better by 0.2%. Alright. So now learning rate scheduler. We've been holding the learning rate eta constant. However, it's often advantageous to vary the learning rate. So early on during the training, it's likely the weights are very wrong because they're randomly initialized. So it's best to use a large learning rates to take larger steps and not be stuck with small steps. And later we can decrease the learning rate to fine tune them. So how should we set our learning rate scheduler? So there are many approaches. One approach is the same as early stopping. So we'll start with a learning rate, and as the validation accuracy gets worse, we'll stop and change the learning rate by dividing by a factor of 2 or 10, and we repeat this many times. So the learning rate is a factor of 1024 or 1000 times lower than the initial value. Alright, and then we terminate. A variable learning scheduler can improve performance, but it also opens up a world of possible choices for the learning schedule. But these choices can give you a headache, and you might spend forever trying to optimize the learning schedule. For first experiments, my suggestion is to use a single constant value, and then for later experimentation, you can fine tune by the lines described. Also, a readable paper which demonstrates this is this paper from 2010. Alright, so I'll add this to my to-do list as well. Alright. So modify network 2.py. Alright, you can do this yourself. Secondly, the regularization parameter. So I suggest starting initially with no regularization and determining the value of eta as above. So using the choice of eta and then using the validation data to select a good value of lambda. So we start by lambda 1 and then increase or decrease by factors of 10. So that's needed to improve. And once you found a good order, you can fine tune the value of lambda that you should return to re-optimize eta again. So once you found lambda, then you should re-optimize eta again and check. Alright, so why is lambda 1? So he doesn't have a very good justification for this. So if anyone has, then mail them please. Alright. An exercise. It's tempting to use gradient descent to try to learn good values for hyperparameters such as lambda and eta. Can you think of an obstacle to using gradient descent to determine lambda? Can you think of an estimate to determine eta? Alright. So for this question, we have the this is our cost function, right? So when n is the length of the training data, this is the cost for quadratic cost, and this is the cross entropy cost. We are familiar with that, and we can see that the cost doesn't depend on eta and all. So we cannot use SDD to determine eta, right? And lambda, for lambda, we can see that the lower it is, the lower is the cost function. So if we want to minimize c by changing lambda, it would decrease until reaching 0. So it would just straight away attempt to reach 0, and that is not what we want. Alright. So how I selected hyperparameters for the book. So if you use the recommendations, you will find good values of eta and lambda, which don't exactly follow the values which the author has used. So think of all the comparisons we made for the different approaches, the new methods we found, and so on. So to make these comparisons meaningful, I've tried to keep the hyperparameters constant across the approaches. Of course, makes sense. Or scale them. Say when you had 50,000 images, you had the learning rate of 1,000, and when you had only 1,000 images, then you had a learning rate of 20, and so on. So there is no reason for the same hyperparameters to be optimal for different approaches to learning. So the hyperparameters are used as something of a compromise. So as an alternate to this compromise, I could have tried to optimize the heck out of the hyperparameters for every single approach. In principle, that would be fairer approach since we'd see the best from every approach. However, we made dozens of comparisons, and in practice, I found it too computationally expensive. So that's why he adopted this method. Alright, now let's have a look at mini batch size. So how should we set a mini batch size? To answer that, let's first suppose that we're doing online learning and we're using mini batch size of 1. So that obviously, the obvious worry about online learning is that using mini batches which contain just a training example will cause significant errors in our estimate. In fact, though the errors turn out not to be such a problem, the reason is that the individual gradient estimates don't need to be super accurate, right? Because we were essentially using mini batches to estimate the gradients. But if we have a single gradient, it could be deviating a lot from the average gradient. So all we need is an estimate accurate enough that the cost function tends to keep decreasing. It's as though you're trying to find the North magnetic pole, but the wonky compass that's 10 degrees off each time you look at it, provided you stop to check the compass frequently and the compass gets the direction right on average, you'll end up on the north magnetic pole just fine. So based on this argument, it sounds we should use online learning. In fact, the situation turns out to be more complicated. So in a problem in chapter 1, I pointed out that it's possible to use matrix techniques to compute a gradient. Yep, we did that rather than looping. Depending on the details of the hardware and linear algebra library, this can be made quite a bit faster to compute a gradient estimate using mini batch gradient estimate by looping over the 100 training examples separately. It might take say only 50 times as longer rather than 100 times longer. So what they're saying is, so rather than computing the mini batch gradient estimate by looping over the 100 examples separately, you could use matrices, which would be better. So it could just take 50 times as long rather than 100 times as long. Right. So now at first it seems as though this doesn't help us that much. With a mini batch of 100, the learning rule for the weights is this. We divided by the mini batch and had the gradient of the cost function being summed and subtracted. So when the sum is over the training examples in the mini batch, that is versus this for online learning, because now you have 1 over 1. Even if it takes 50 times as long to do the mini batch update, it still seems likely to be better to do online learning because we'd be updating so much more frequently that we'd perform better. So that's the intuition that they're trying to give. However, that in the mini batch case, we decrease the learning rate by a factor of 100, so the update rule becomes this. So that's a lot like doing 100 separate instances of online learning with a learning rate eta. But it only takes about 50 times as long as doing a single instance of online learning. Right. So of course it's not truly the same as 100 instances of online learning since it's the mini batch. The delta C x's are all evaluated for the same weights as opposed to the cumulative learning that occurs in the online case. Still, it seems distinctly possible that using the larger mini batch would speed things up because you won't be computing the gradient over and over and over again. Alright, so with these factors in mind, choosing the best mini batch size is a compromise. Too small and you don't get to take full advantage, and too large and you're simply not updating the weights often enough. So what you need to do is find a compromise which maximizes the speed of learning. Fortunately, the choice of mini batch at which the speed is maximized is relatively independent of the other hyperparameters, and so you don't need to have optimized these hyperparameters in order to find a good mini batch size. So mini batch size is independent of the other hyperparameters. So you can do this individually. You don't need to do this and then do them. The way is to find some acceptable value for the other hyperparameters and then trial with mini batch sizes, scaling eta as above. So plotting the validation accuracy versus time, as in real time elapsed, not epoch, and choose whether mini batch size gives you which mini batch size gives you the best performance, and that is certainly the way to go. Of course, as you've no doubt realized, I haven't done optimization in our work. Indeed, our implementation doesn't use the faster approach to mini batch updates at all. I have simply used a mini batch size of 10 without comment or explanation in nearly all examples. Because of this, we could have sped up training by reducing the mini batch size. I haven't done this in part because I want to illustrate the use of mini batch size beyond size 1, and in part because my preliminary experiment suggested the speed up would be rather modest, right? So in practical implementations, however, we would most certainly implement a faster approach to mini batch updates and then make an effort to optimize the mini batch size. So what he's saying is we saw that there's a faster approach to mini batch implementation, but we're not doing it. But when you do this in real life, you would probably be doing that. All right. So we are near in the end. Let's look at the automated techniques. So I've been describing the heuristics as though you're optimizing your hyperparameters by hand. Hand optimization is a good way, but that's not how it's really done. A technique is grid search, which systematically searches through a grid and hyperparameter space. A review of both the achievements and limitations of grid search can be found in this paper, and many more techniques are there like Bayesian approach to automatically optimizing hyperparameters. Alright, so you can have a look at these. Summing up. Alright, following the rule of thumb I've described, I won't give you the absolute best possible result from the neural nets, but it will be likely give you a very good start, right? So in practice, there are relationships between the hyperparameters where you may experiment with eta. When you start experimenting with lambda, you might notice that it's messing with your optimized eta. So you'll have to work around with both of them. Alright. So the difficulty of choosing hyperparameters is the fact that hyperparameters are widely used, and the reasoning is often alright. So let's just read it. So across many research-driven software programs that often is only available inside the heads of individual practitioners. There are many paper settings recommendation for how to proceed. Right. So some paper might give some other approach. So Joshua Bengio has a 2012 paper which gives some practical recommendations. Bengio discusses many issues in much more detail than I have, including how to do more systematic hyperparameter searches. Another good paper is the 1998 famous Jan LeCun LeNet paper. Both these papers appear to be very useful in an extremely useful 2012 book that collects many tricks. Alright, so this is a book. The book is expensive, but many articles have been placed online by the respective authors, with one presumes the blessing of the publisher and may be located using a search engine. Alright. So the book itself is like, yeah, 85, 86 pounds, but as I said, it's available online. The articles individually, some of them are. So one thing that becomes clear as you read them is that it totally depends on you. You need to experiment. You need to find the best fit for your function. So there's a common saying among writers that books are never finished, only abandoned. The same is for neural network optimization. The space is so large you can't find a perfect fit, right? So the challenge of setting this has to let to people complain against neural networks. So I've heard many variations. Yes, a relative neural network performs well, better than uh, better on the problem. On the other hand, I can try a random forest or SVM and it just works. I don't have to figure out the right neural network. Of course, from a practical point of view, it's good enough to have easy techniques in your arsenal. This is particularly true when you are starting off on a problem, and it may be not be obvious which problem to use. But while it would be nice if machine learning were always easy, there's no a priori reason it should be trivially simple. So what they're saying is some people complain about neural networks, but even with the other stuff also you need to do optimizations to get to a good place. And of course the SVMs and other things are also very great techniques to start up because you don't always know what sort of model you need. Alright, so other techniques, each technique developed in this chapter is valuable to know in its own right, but that's not the only reason I've explained. The larger point is to familiarize with other techniques as well. So variation on stochastic gradient descent. So we have Hessian and momentum techniques. Alright. So in the Hessian technique, in we'll take the cost function as a function, and by using Taylor's theorem we will approximate it. All right, so Taylor's theorem uses this as is used to approximate functions, and you can see this is the general formula of Taylor function with just w and delta w and c as the terms, and we can write this more compactly. I have not studied this stuff, so this looks awfully complicated to me. So gradients is the usual gradient vector. H is the matrix known as the Hessian matrix, whose jkth entry is this. So we can approximate C by discarding the higher order terms and just using these many terms. And using calculus, we can show this thing. So I don't know how, but this is what they did. So provided we have 105 as a good expression, then we expect that moving from point W to point W plus delta W should significantly decrease the cost function. So that suggests a new possible algorithm for minimizing the cost. We'll start a W, choose a W, we'll update W using the Hessian H and gradient C, and we'll update W dash. So in practice, this is only a small approximation. It's better to take smaller steps, and we can do this by using eta, the learning rate. So this is similar, quite similar to what we've done. Hessian technique or Hessian optimization. There are theoretical and empirical advantages, showing that Hessian methods converge on a minimum in fewer steps by incorporating information about second order changes in the cost function. It's possible for the Hessian approach to avoid many pathologies that can occur in gradient descent. Furthermore, there are reasons for backpropagation algorithm which can be used to compute the Hessian. So if Hessian optimization show great, why aren't we using it? So it has a very undesirable property. It's very difficult to apply it in practice. Part of the problem is the sheer size of the Hessian matrix. Alright. Suppose you have a neural network with 10 to the power 7 weights and biases, then you'll have 10 to the power 14 entries, and computing this makes it very difficult and computationally expensive. However, that doesn't mean it's not useful to understand. In fact, there are many variations of gradient descent which are inspired by the Hessian optimization. Alright. Next is momentum-based gradient descent. Intuitively, the advantage Hessian optimization has that it incorporates not just information about the gradient, but also how the gradient is changing. Right. So momentum-based gradient descent is based on a similar intuition, but avoids large matrices of second derivatives. All right. To understand the momentum technique, think back to our original picture. I remember it, in which we considered a ball rolling. At the point we observed a gradient descent, despite its name only loosely similar to a ball. The momentum technique modifies gradient descent in two ways. First, it introduces a new concept of velocity. Okay, so this seems reasonable because as you go down a hill, the velocity of the ball would increase. The gradient acts to change the velocity, not directly the position, in much the same way as physical forces change the velocity and only indirectly affect position. Secondly, the momentum method introduces a friction term which tends to gradually reduce the velocity. Alright, so velocity is in will okay. So the weights are now changed by this velocity prime term, and it is a combination of the initial velocity and the gradient. And these equations, mu is a hyperparameter which controls the damping or the friction force. And to understand the meaning, if we have mu 1, that means there is no friction, but we have, if mu is zero point 0.9, then after each iteration the velocity would be zero point 0.9 times of itself. When that's the case, sorry, not zero point 0.9 times, you multiply it by zero point 0.9 and then subtract the eta times the gradient. So when that's the case, inspection of the equation shows that the force gradient C is now modifying the velocity, and the velocity is controlling the rate of change of W. Of course, intuitively we build up the velocity by repeatedly adding gradient terms. That means that if the gradient is in roughly the same direction through several roundings of learning, we can build up quite a bit of steam moving in that direction. And think, for example, it would be similar to moving down a slope. So with each step, the velocity gets larger down the slope, so we move more quickly. This enables the momentum technique to work much faster. All right. So of course the problem is that once we reach the bottom, we will overshoot, or if the gradient should change rapidly, then we'll find ourselves moving in the wrong direction, and that's the reason for mu. Mu controls the amount of friction, so you should think as 1 minus mu as the amount of friction in the system. So when mu is 1, we've seen that there is no friction. When mu is 0, there's a lot of friction. The velocity can't build up, and these equations just reduce as they normally did without any velocity concept. So in practice, using a value of mu between 0 and 1 can give us a benefit of building up speed and not overshooting too much. Alright. So I've avoided naming this parameter. The reason is that the standard naming for mu is badly chosen. It's called momentum coefficient. That is partly confusing because mu is not at all the same as the notion of momentum from physics. Rather, it is much more closely related to friction. Alright. A nice thing about the momentum technique is that almost takes no work to modify an implementation of gradient descent to incorporate momentum. You can still use backprop to compute the gradient just as before and use ideas such as sampling stochastically chosen mini batches. In this way, so using this way we can perform much better with only minor modifications in our code. So if we use momentum greater than 1, then this means that the ball is in fact not, there is more than you giving energy to the ball, you're initially speeding up the ball much more. And if we use momentum less than 0, then a similar analogy can be used. Okay, so there's a bit more stuff which I sorry do not have the time to cover right now. I'll take this up in the next video. Hopefully that would be a short one.